Do you know your story? You might say, well, of course I do. I'm living it. However, most people understand their lives as a series of unrelated calendar appointments. We'd be hard-pressed to identify our life's narrative plot, its major themes, or character transformations. Sometimes we feel more like a supporting cast than the main character in our own story. And that's why this fall at Salt House, we want to invite you to become a student of your story and discover what God is doing in and through the pages of your life. If you're struggling to find purpose and old wounds don't seem to heal, if you're trying to figure out what's next in my life and you have no clue as to where God is in any of it, then we want to equip you with some theological tools to read your story and begin co-authoring your life with God. The writings of Dr. Dan Allender offer some helpful categories to guide your season of story work, beginning with Shalom. This is where all good stories begin, in the peaceful garden, in the cozy Hobbit Shire, where innocence is intact, and we feel naked and unashamed. But the next act brings the shattering of Shalom. Apples are eaten, trust is betrayed, and vulnerability exploited. We become disoriented, widowed, orphaned, and we feel alienated. And what develops is called the core wound. Most of our lives are lived in Act 3, the search for Shalom. We try everything in our power to get back to Eden. We get straight A's, we grow the business, we discard imperfect partners, convinced we can put all the pieces of a shattered Shalom back together. Then comes the fourth act, always as a surprise, because real salvation can't even be imagined. It is completely God's doing. Wrongs become righted, reunions are sweet, and there's usually good food and drink, dancing and laughter. And there's just enough closure for the story to start again. If all of this sounds familiar, it's because it is the story arc of the Bible, and it is the story that God is writing in your life too. And that's precisely why we say here at Salt House, stories matter. Your story holds a greater glory to it, just waiting to be told. It reveals God. So, do you know your story?
Good morning, Salt House.
Good morning.
You know, when you write a sermon, you really want to start out with something relevant, like something that is current, something contemporary, part of the culture, which is why I thought today we'd start out with Frasier. Because you saw they rebooted Frasier, right? Like what's old is officially new again. TV is like bell-bottom jeans. Like there are officially no stories left, only 90s sitcoms to remake. And if I do say so myself, the new Frasier is actually pretty good. Like it picks up with Frasier returning to Boston, where his character was originally on Cheers. And in several of the new episodes, Frasier laments that when he left Boston at the end of Cheers, it was kind of begrudgingly and because of his divorce. And he went to Seattle, where he became a radio celebrity. And then at the end of Frasier, he went to Chicago and became a talk show host. And now, after like 30 years of celebrity, he wants to return to Boston to make things right, to reconnect with his son, with his friends, with his passion for psychology. This is a shameless plug, but it's a pretty cute reboot. And it's also this storytelling circle that we've been exploring. Like when Frasier's life shattered, he went searching for it in Seattle. He went searching for it in celebrity. He went searching for it in countless relationships, because you know on a 90s sitcom, a relationship lasts 2 episodes. It's a lot of searching. But now Frasier's surprised to find that what he was searching for was there all along. It was his son, it was his friends, it was his passions. And that's what we've been talking about this whole past month. When in your life did you experience shalom? When did your shalom shatter? What does your search look like? And is it possible that your salvation was hidden in your story all along? This final part of the story arc, this salvation piece, kind of makes me think of the Wizard of Oz. You know, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion always had the brains and the hearts and the courage. Running away from home wasn't what Dorothy thought it would be, and it turned out she had the ability to go home all along. And so this is the final piece of the arc, that the ability to go home is in front of you all along. The happily ever after is hidden in plain sight. And I don't know about you, but that feels really hard to talk about. Like the world feels a little darker today, and not just because of the clouds. I mean, with stories of war and genocide and hypocrisy dominating global politics, with a partisan government ever more dysfunctional, with racism and queerphobia still baked into systems, I would love a surprise salvation. But I think we're still searching for it. And so I think today's sermon might be a little challenging because the reality is most of us are still in shattered and searching places. But if we don't talk about the surprise of salvation, if we don't imagine what it could be like, if we don't dream about it, then we might miss it. So friends, will you join me in a little bit of dreaming today? Because last week in the search phase, Pastor Ryan introduced us to a dreamer, and we haven't finished his story just yet. Ryan took us into the last story of Genesis, which is the story of Joseph. And I don't have time to recap everything Ryan went over. You'll have to go back and watch Act 1 if you missed it. But the cliff notes are that Joseph was his father's favorite son, and that was his experience of shalom, his father's love and affection. But Joseph had these dreams where he was elevated over his brother, and they bowed down to him, and Joseph's brothers hated that. So they conspired, and they sold Joseph into slavery, and that was his shattering. So he continued to search for that fatherly love and affection that he had known, and he found himself in these cycles of being promoted to places of favor and power, and then losing it over and over again. And that's where we meet Joseph today. But can I just say, I relate to Joseph so much. I mean, I talked about this in my Shalom sermon a few weeks ago, but my father loved me. He doted on me. He built me a train set that I adored. He volunteered in my Boy Scout troop. Anywhere I went, my father was about 2 steps behind me. Part of my experience of Shalom was my father's love and affection too. And my shattering was also about my dad. When I was in 3rd grade, I brought home a double-digit subtraction worksheet. And I can still picture it. It had this little dog riding a rocket ship in the margin. And this was 3rd grade, which you know is that make or break year that determines your future. And on this worksheet, I had received a check minus. You felt it. You understand what a check minus is. And my dad sat me down and told me that check minuses do not go anywhere in the world. And I'm not sure what words he actually used, but that is what my 8-year-old brain heard. The disappointment in his eyes darkened every memory of that train set. And I vowed in my head to never be a check minus again. Have you had a moment like this in your story? A moment that you thought, I never want to feel this way again. That might be the thread of your shattering in your story. But let's get back to Joseph. His search for favor and attention gets him framed and accused and wrongly sent to prison. And the story skips ahead a little bit between chapters. And when we resume, we're introduced to this butler and this baker, both of whom worked in the palace for Pharaoh. And the story opens with the 2 of them being thrown into prison and Joseph being told to look after them. It seems like even in prison, Joseph has found himself rising to the top and some sort of favoritism with the guards. And in a famous scene in the story, Joseph brings the baker and the butler their food, and the 2 men are talking about how they had dreams the night before, these dreams that troubled them. And it's funny because Ryan talked about this coat being a symbol of favoritism in Joseph's story, but dreams are also a symbol. Like Joseph was a dreamer. So he leans in and asks them to tell him about their dreams, and they do. And Joseph realizes that the butler's dream reveals that he will soon be freed and restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. But Joseph predicts that the baker's dream is one of doom. He sees that this dream reveals that Pharaoh will soon have the baker executed. The baker kicks dirt and huffs off in a rage, but the butler looks at Joseph and says, "If what you say is true, I will remember you, and when Pharaoh sets me free, I will make sure he frees you too." And in the coming days, Pharaoh does send for both the butler and the baker, and the butlers return to service in the court, but the baker gets sentenced to death. Everything happens just as Joseph predicted. But the butler forgets about Joseph. And for 2 years, Joseph sits in prison. Do you have any of that in your story? Any broken promises? Any I love yous that weren't quite as genuine as you thought? Anybody who made you feel forgotten? Joseph's search led him to prison. Most of my searching was in Boy Scouts. It was way easier. Determined to win my dad's approval and never be a check minus again, I went on to earn my Eagle Scout. But did you know that there are awards that come after Eagle Scout? After you earn Eagle, for each 5 additional merit badges and 6 months of leadership you do, you can earn an award called a palm. There are 3 of them: bronze, gold, and silver. And I earned all 3. I got inducted into the Boy Scout Honor Society, and in that Honor Society, there's a board that oversees programming for the regional council. I was on that board, and at 19, I was president of that board. When my term as president ended, I took a 2-year position as a regional trainer for the Boy Scouts, and at 20, they were flying me all over the country to present at leadership conferences. Who's not going anywhere now, Dad? Can't be a check minus when you have all the awards. And yet something was missing. Because part of the problem is if our dreams for our lives aren't about serving others, then we aren't dreaming about salvation. We're only dreaming about power. Our dreams either help us escape our shattering or they help us heal it. But if we want the healing to come, we have to look beyond ourselves. We have to ask the question, who am I to serve? This question is the first step to seeing the salvation in your story. Who am I to serve? We can only love our pasts and heal our wounds when we realized that they formed us in ways that will benefit others. So when groups or spaces or causes allow you not to hide from your shattering, but to be your authentic self and give your wisdom, you're onto something there. Who are you to serve? Now, Joseph's tale takes an unexpected twist. Joseph is rotting in jail when Pharaoh is awakened by strange dreams, nightmares, and he consults with the court magicians who are unable to interpret them. He brings in the priests from the entire Egyptian pantheon, but they can't explain these dreams. And just when the whole kingdom is scrambling to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, I imagine there's kind of this like record screech in the butler's brain, like, dreams? I might know a guy. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and he is brought to the court, and Pharaoh tells him of these dreams, this dream where 7 healthy cows and 7 sickly cows are on either side of the Nile, and the 7 sickly cows eat the 7 healthy cows. And Joseph predicts that Pharaoh's dream is a message from God, a warning that 7 years of lush, fertile farming are ahead for Egypt. There will be so much food, they won't possibly be able to eat it all. Everything will grow, life will be easy, and Egypt will know abundance. But these 7 years will be followed by 7 years of famine, where nothing will grow, the Nile will run dry, livestock will die, and the entire Levant region will suffer. And Joseph suggests that Pharaoh heed this dream and appoint a special advisor so that over these next 7 years, food can be gathered and stored. And then a system to give out food can be designated. Otherwise, many people and many lands are going to suffer. And Joseph turns to go back to jail, I assume, when Pharaoh stops him and is like, Joseph, you are the only one who could interpret this dream. This God of yours must be a very powerful God. I want you to be my advisor. I want you to be the grand vizier of the court. I want you to be my number 2. You are going to be the one to lead us through this famine. So talk about a storybook ending. I mean, talk about getting everything you ever wanted. Joseph becomes second only to Pharaoh. And in Egyptian society, Pharaoh was a god, which makes Joseph the most powerful human in the Egyptian empire. He made it. And more than once, he's made it to this point before, but this time he's successful. The 7 years of feast happen just as he predicted, and then overnight, everything changes. 7 years of famine hit Egypt, but Egypt's ready. They have food supplies, they have water reserves, they continue on together under the leadership of Joe. And it's interesting because who would have thought that this nobody betrayed by his family, sold into slavery, taken to a foreign land, framed, in and out of prison, would be such an important part of Egypt's salvation. And I think this begs another question about our salvation stories. Ask yourself this: where am I called to be? As much as we would like to keep our options open, we can't. Some stories just aren't for us. We can't go back. Joseph never dreamed of Egypt, but his shattering led him there. But there was important work for him to do in that place. So where has your shattering led you? Might you be exactly where you are supposed to be right now? Or is there somewhere that you're afraid to go? And yet deep down you know that if healing is going to happen, you have to go to that place. Where are you called to be? Joseph's dream interpretation helped save Egypt. And in Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical about Joseph, the narrator says, this would be the perfect place to stop the show. But it feels a little off, doesn't it? Like there's something unsatisfying about getting exactly what you want. Have you ever felt that? Have you gotten what you wanted only to realize it wasn't what you wanted? And I think that's part of the brilliance of Joseph's story. He gets what he wants. He couldn't be more successful. And yet something is missing. It just doesn't fill the void like he thought it would. Martin Luther would call this cheap grace. When you've manufactured your happy ending, when you've gotten all the material things you desired, when your needs are taken care of, when your enemies fail, it's cheap grace to think that God is on your side because you're happy. Because the mystery of God's grace is that God loves everybody. And material success is rarely a sign of God's grace. You know, my time in the Boy Scouts had a little bit of the same discomfort. My dad was so supportive and proud of all the things I did in Scouts. And while I might have been the world's best Boy Scout, you know what you couldn't be as a volunteer for the Boy Scouts in 2014? Gay. I think part of the reason I didn't question my sexuality until I was 24 was that I couldn't. It was literally against the rules. If I admitted to myself back then that I was gay, I'd lose everything. I'd be a check minus all over again. Remember that moment when you thought, oh, I never want to feel that way again? Does that moment show up for you over and over in your story? I mean, it certainly does for Joseph. While Joseph might be riding high in Egypt, a strange twist happens. The entire region is suffering. And one day, as Joseph is visiting the food banks, he does a double take. Because standing in line are faces that he recognizes. His brothers have come to Egypt. And the reality of who Joseph was comes crashing in. Like he might be Grand Vizier, but in that moment, he probably feels like he's back in a pit. He's back to being abandoned and forsaken. He's the brother who got sold. And there's more. Among these brothers, he sees a new brother, a new youngest son, who's his father's new favorite. He is face to face with his shattering. Can you relate to that fear? Can you taste the bile of being face to face with your deepest wounds? And yet that's how the surprise of salvation happens. You can't see salvation until you come face to face with the thing that shattered you. The family drama with Joseph goes deep. Like there's 6 more chapters of this. The cycle of family trauma keeps coming and coming and coming because the brothers don't recognize Joseph at first. So he kind of toys with them. He eventually frames Benjamin and condemns him to a life of slavery. And in that moment, something happens. His brothers throw themselves on the ground and say, "Please, sir, don't do this. Benjamin is our father's favorite son, but he had another son, Joseph. Our father loved our brother Joseph, and we betrayed him. We can't lose another brother. We can't do that to our father. We can't do that to our family. Please take us, enslave us, and punish us. But let Benjamin go. For the sake of our father, please let Benjamin go." Everyone in the room is now looking at what happened. Like no one is searching. Everyone is sitting in the shattering. I was lucky. I knew my parents would love me and accept me when I came out. But I was still scared to come out to my dad. I mean, he had all these dreams for my life, and I just didn't want to crush that for him. I didn't want him to look at me differently, and I really didn't want him to say, well, I hope you're happy being a check minus. Or, you know, son, gay people don't go anywhere in the world. I could hear him say it, but when I came out to him, he wrote me a letter. And in that letter, he said this: life is really about the simple things, son. Being happy, being with someone you love, finding the courage to be who you are. And that's my dream for you. I'm proud of you for chasing who you are. Love, Dad. My father's love and approval that I had chased all my life had been there all along. Have you ever experienced this kind of foolishness? Like, have you had that moment when you saw that life was not as complicated as you thought? Because I'll tell you this, when my dad died, my GPA didn't matter. None of those awards mattered. None of those speaker credits mattered. But that letter mattered. And in a similar way, Joseph comes out to his brothers. The text says that he weeps so loud that all of Egypt hears him. And he announces that he is their long-lost brother. And they embrace him. And Joseph meets his new brother Benjamin, and he's reunited with his father before his father passes. Now, I'm really lucky. As a queer person, I came out to a completely affirming family, and most people don't get that. As a son, I got closure with my dad, who told me he was proud of me, and most people don't get that either. But the affirmation was not my salvation, and the closure with my dad was not my salvation. In many ways, my search continues. I mean, I'm left with questions. Questions like, who would I be if I hadn't spent all those years chasing my dad's approval? Or who would I be if I hadn't spent all those years in an organization that kept me from finding myself? Or who would I be if I hadn't spent my college years serving on boards and flying around the country? Do you have questions like this in your story? Questions of, who would I be if? When we ask those questions, we're really asking, who would I be if my shattering hadn't happened? I mean, these questions are all part of that searching. And Joseph's story actually answers these questions. Let's actually look at these final words from Genesis. We'll have it for you here on the screen. Let's read this together. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave us this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. I am in the place of God. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This text defines salvation. These words, "Even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." Even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good. This is how salvation shows up over and over again in the Bible. Every time the people of God get in their own way, God continues to do good things through them. Every time suffering hits, God continues to do good things through those with broken hearts. What the world intends as harm, God continues to work for good. And this is not to say that God requires suffering. God does not cause suffering. God does not orchestrate suffering. God is not in the business of suffering. But suffering doesn't scare God. And suffering doesn't change God. Salvation is a promise that even when you suffer, even when your world is shattered, God is still doing good things through you. I mean, this is the entire theology of the cross. This weapon that Rome uses for torture, God uses to prove God's own solidarity with those who suffer. God uses the cross to prove that God's love knows no limits. God uses the cross to prove that even death is no match for God. The surprise of this whole storytelling arc is that God is at work in shattered stories. God is there the entire time. Your story does not require a happy ending. It doesn't require a success or closure. It doesn't require the neat, tidy bow. God is with you in your story, loving you, leading you, and holding you through every single shattered moment of it. Like when homophobia condemns queer folks, God says, no, I am at work in these stories. And when racism says that your life doesn't matter, God says, no, I am at work in these stories. And when the world tries to pick who we support and who we condemn, God says, no, I am at work in these stories. When someone tells you you're not good enough, God says, no, I am at work in your story. When that inner critic is like, how could you have let this happen again? God says, no, I am at work in this story. When your family or your friends or your boss or whoever says you didn't do enough, God says, no, I am at work in your story. Whenever you are condemned, however the world shatters you, God says, no, I am at work in your story. And this is good news because it means that we can write a better ending, one that isn't manufactured or based on ignoring old wounds or based on winning. We can write an ending where we live the abundant and innocent lives that God created us to live. You see, even though I was chasing my father's approval, and even though I was in this cycle of volunteering with the Scouts, the loving voice of God still spoke truth into my life. The shattering and the searching was not who I was made to be. And that's the surprise. So as you consider your own salvation, the final question you might ask is this: what burden am I to bear? God calls everyone to be part of the healing of the world, to relieve suffering, to pursue justice, to facilitate reconciliation, and to do so in ways that reveal the nature of God. And some of that world is out in the world, and some of it's in our communities, some of it's in our homes and families, and sometimes it's in our own hearts. There are a million ways to break a cycle of hurt. We don't have time to recap all the cycles of hurt in Joseph's story, but I can tell you that I've seen God use my story of healing, my coming out, for something wonderful in the world. And I wonder how God is using your story for healing, for something wonderful in the world too. So friends, these are the guiding questions for the surprise of salvation. Who am I to serve? Where am I to be? What burden am I to bear? Who am I to serve? Where am I to be? What burden am I to bear? And as we close our time together, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Zach. These questions are about my future. What about where I am in my story right now? What am I supposed to write today? Well, that's the surprise. Our stories are not our own, but they reveal this truth, that while the world may shatter you, God will never give up on you. God has a beautiful purpose for your life. And when you see what God has done and is doing in and through you, you'll see that your life is going to be one hell of a story. Amen.